Welcome back, America. It's Hugh Hewitt in the ReliefFactor.com studio with the Patriot Mobile Member of the Week, Congressman Mike Gallagher from the great state of Wisconsin. Ordinarily, I would bring up the fact that their allegedly pro team in Wisconsin, the NBA, collapsed. But in honor of the GOAT, Bart Starr, I'm not going to do that, Mike Gallagher.
I appreciate that. The wound is still fresh. Nothing makes sense anymore. Dwayne's married. The universe is completely disordered. I can't make sense of it. But a quick note on Bart Starr. Obviously, we know everything he achieved on the field in the Lombardi era. And I would recommend everyone David Moranis' book, When Pride Still Mattered. But what he did in my district in Northeast Wisconsin, just as a citizen, as a philanthropist, is incredible. He started something called the Rawhide Boys Ranch, which continues to save lives of young, troubled men in Northeast Wisconsin. And his legacy is all around us. So very sad for the community, but he will be remembered.
You know, there was a question posed on Twitter yesterday about what famous person have you met who turned out to be far better than your expectation. For me, it was Brian Sight. Turned out to be absolutely the most wonderful guy, Christian guy, working with kids all the time in San Diego. Just a wonderful, humble guy. And it sounds like Bart Starr was the same way.
Completely. That's why I wear a Bart Starr jersey to every Packers game. So I have a vintage Bart Starr jersey, and I think he just embodies the ethos of Northeast Wisconsin, just humble, hardworking guy, and just an incredible story.
All right, we got work to do, though. Boy, do we have a lot of issues. First of all, I want to defend the crew on the WASP yesterday that were wearing MAGA patches. They're enlisted men that go out in helicopters for search and rescue missions. They're in harm's way all the time, and they like the president, so they put a MAGA patch on there. What's your advice to the Navy? Because some people got their heads all torqued. I wouldn't have minded if they wore President Obama patches.
Well, as our mutual friend, Captain Jerry Hendricks, knows, it's impossible to instill uniform discipline in the Navy. Obviously, it wouldn't fly in the Marine Corps, but I'll give the Navy some slack. But listen, on a serious note, I don't think this was a political statement other than a bunch of young enlisted sailors wanted to attract the attention of their commander-in-chief, possibly get a picture with him. So I think the media's attempt to make a huge deal out of this is very misplaced. All
right, number two, the president made some unusual comments on aircraft carriers. I know enough about aircraft carriers to get into trouble, and I know enough about procurement to get into real trouble, but you can't change carriers in midstream. I mean, it would destroy the idea of a 355 Navy to say, after these two Ford class, we're going back to the Nimitz. It doesn't even make any sense.
The train is indeed leaving the station. Now, on the one hand, I'm glad President Trump is taking such a detailed interest in Navy ships because we need a lot more of them, and it's going to require the president's consistent involvement in making the case to the American people if we ever want to get to 355. But the propulsion system, EMALS, that he's referring to is really one of the centerpieces of the new Ford-class carriers. It reduces stress on the carrier-based aircraft by accelerating aircraft launching off of it more gradually, and that lengthens the service life of the ship. Now, with any new technology, Hugh, especially one as complex as this, you're going to see bugs, you're going to have kinks that you have to work out, but it doesn't mean you go back and throw the baby out with the bathwater because that would cost billions of dollars. But I think the president is really getting at this bigger question. Is the juice worth the squeeze when it comes to aircraft carriers? I mean, the fact is your average cost of a Nimitz class, the previous class across the 10 ships we built was about $5.5 billion. The Ford class, this class is going to be no less than $12 billion. We're probably never going to get it below that. So the question, I think the president's asking this broader question of does the increased costs, increasing complexity, is it justified? And I think that's where he's coming from. Fair question. And I think the Navy needs to do a better job defending the role of the carriers, the carrier strike group in the 21st century. But when we talk about the carrier, what we really need to be talking about is the carrier air wing and the air wing's inability to reach its target in a modern A2AD environment. We need to make big investments in increasing the range and lethality of the air wing, particularly with unmanned systems. And if we don't do that, then indeed people can rightly question why we're investing in carriers.
You know, Mike, I've been listening to Rule the Waves, Arthur Herman's excellent history of the British Navy. And in World War II, both Britain and the United States turned to far less expensive but rapidly built half flat tops and pocket battleships. They went small, but they went for a lot. Is that part of this discussion?
I think that has to be where the Navy prioritizes. That doesn't mean you sort of get rid of your foundation of carriers and destroyers and things like that. But if we want to rapidly get to 355, we have to be leveraging things like autonomous ships in order to get there. And I think a good friend of mine, Chris Brose, has done a good job of laying that case out in a recent Foreign Affairs article, the need for a lot of inexpensive ships that aren't as exquisite, which really complicates the targeting picture for China, for example, and creates dilemmas in the enemy's mind. Now, I give the Navy credit for prioritizing autonomous systems in their budget request. That has to be an increased piece of the puzzle here as we figure this thing out.
All right, last category. Yesterday or the day before, Lockheed said, count us out of the FFGX competition. Would you first tell people what the FFGX is?
The FFGX is the future frigate, so what we call a small surface combatant. So think something smaller than a destroyer, but still a big ship that has weapons on it that can go places in harbors, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region, that just big ships like destroyers can't go. Right now, that is the littoral combat ship. We are moving away from the littoral combat ship and moving towards the frigate, which has a little bit more heft to it. Hopefully can carry some more lethal weapon systems on it. Now, in my shipyard, we are going to compete what's called the FREM, which is really the centerpiece of what Fincantieri, which is the world's best shipbuilder, Fincantieri Marinette Marine, built. And we're very excited about competing that ship. We're excited about a new arrangement where the shipbuilder will actually be what's called the prime. Previously, Lockheed was the prime, and the shipbuilder was subordinate to Lockheed. So I actually think this will ultimately result in a better ship, a more cost-efficient ship for the Navy. And I think Lockheed dropping out recognizes the reality that the Navy wants to move away from the LCS design.
Before I come back to the timeline, I also want to reference again to Rule the Waves by Arthur Herman. Turns out in World War I and subsequently in World War II, a lot of small ships, sub-chasers and PT boats and destroyers are what saved England because they were able to do convoy duty and defeat the wolf packs. We need a lot of FFGXs, and we got to get started. When does the Navy intend to pick one and get going?
The award's going to come, I believe, in July 2020, if I'm getting that correctly. At least that was the Navy plans to announce the outcome of the FFGX competition. The designs are underway. It's going to be a very robust competition, but as soon as we get that awarded, we need to get to building it. And just to make another point on the need for smaller ships, well, let me make two points here. So a smaller ship than even an FFGX would, for example, be a Mark VI patrol boat that you could deploy from the well deck of an amphibious ship. So very small. But you can imagine in a future environment putting something like a long-range missile, an LRASM, on a Mark VI patrol boat, and all of a sudden you've taken a very small ship and made it a very lethal weapon that's going to create a lot of dilemmas for the PLA Navy or the PLA Rocket Force. And that's sort of the creative thinking we need to have in the Navy right now as we think about how do we really increase our presence in the priority theater, the Indo-Pacific theater, what we would call the Eurasian Rimland. And the second point I'd make on that, Hugh, more smaller ships also creates more command opportunities for younger Navy officers.
No, true.
Which is ultimately how we win relative to China, right? China's weakness is that it's a very hierarchical system, a very top-down system. In some ways, we need to embrace what is great about America, and that's our innovative spirit. And that not only applies to the private sector, it applies to our military, right? We operate under what's called commander's intent. We are at our best when we've devolved power and authority down to the lowest possible level. And that's how we succeed over our enemies in a very chaotic environment where, for example, you could use cyber weapons to negate your technological advantages. We need to embrace that and be able to outcompete our adversaries in that chaotic environment.
Last question, Congressman Gallagher. It seems to me that if we advance the timetable for the decision, it would not only get the ships faster, it would be a real-world test run of how quickly we can get the defense industrial base to operate. I'm reading this World War II history, and boy, did we turn on a dime. And issues came from, orders came from Washington, shipbuilders changed, and they made up their mix. If we said we're picking in 19 and we're producing in 20, it would be a great stress test of our ability to deliver.
So I agree. Let's pick Northeast Wisconsin today. Marinette should win the competition right now, and we'll get to building these ships, and they'll be the best ships in the fleet.
But what about my concept? If it's not Frem, if it's anybody, anything, we haven't made a quick decision in any of the armed services on a platform. As long as I can remember, we've never acted quickly.
Well, I think it's risk aversion. Some of it's warranted, right? I think if you look back on the lessons learned of the Littoral Combat Ship, there was a lot of changes in design along the way that increased the cost. We never really settled on a fixed design. And there was a lot of increase in complexity and a lot of uncertainty. And so I think the Navy wants to avoid that. But you're right that we need to balance that with the sense of urgency of getting these ships in the water. And the whole point of having more small surface combatants, a greater number of smaller ships, is that these things aren't the most exquisite vessels in the fleet, right? They may be more vulnerable than some other designs, but they are in what is called the contact layer as you look at the Pentagon's global operating model. We want them visible every single day to the enemy. We want them out there. We want them to have presence. We want them to be engaged in the business of deterrence by denial, telling the enemy every single day that they will not be able to achieve their objectives, whether it's seizing Taiwan rapidly or militarizing the South and East China Sea, things like that. And that is the promise of the future frigate.
Representative Gallagher, thank you. Follow him on Twitter at Rep. Gallagher.